Okay, here we go. Okay, so I'm on Scene Warfare. I did 2 episodes of the occult Renaissance of the Church of Rome, and this is kind of a continuation of that. I just named it Apocalypse because I'm going to be going over other um, things. So I think I'm going to start with something here. Let me go through these articles real quick. Let's see what seems fitting to go over. All right. So we're going to start with this article, The Jays, the Masons, and the French Revolution. Okay, it's by Vladimir Moss. And he says on January 21st, 1793, King Louis of France was guillotined. After the execution, a huge old man with an old beard who had been prominent in the murdering of priests during the September riots mounted the scaffold, plunged both hands into the king's blood, and sprinkled the people with it, shouting, "People of France, I baptize you in the name of Jacob and freedom." Who was Jacob? There were various theories. Some think it was the ghost of Jacob Mollet, the leader of the Templars who was executed by the Catholic Church. Others think it refers to the Masons of the Scottish Rite who were supporters of the Stuart Jacobites. Others think it's a reference to the patriarch Jacob's struggle with God in Genesis 32. Some think, quote, Jacob simply refers to Jahre. So we're the French now baptized in the spirit of the Jewish Revolution. In order to answer this question, we need to go back a little in time to the Jewish and Masonic origins of the Revolution. The Jays and the Revolution. It was the French Revolution that gave the Jays the opportunity to burst through in the forefront of the world politics for the first time since the fall of Jerusalem in the 70 AD. There were 39,000 of them in France, and in 1789, most, half according to one estimate, 9/10 according to another, were Yiddish speaking Ashkenazim living in Alsace and Lorraine, which France had acquired under the terms of the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Quote, it is important, writes Nesta Webster, quote, to distinguish between the two races of Jays, the Ashkenazi and the Sephardim. In discussing the questions of the Jewish emancipation at the time of the Revolution, for whilst the Sephardim had shown themselves good citizens and were therefore subject to no persecutions, the Ashkenazim, by their extraordinate usury and oppressions, had made themselves detested by the people, so that rigorous laws were enforced to restrain their rapacity. The discussions that raged in the National Assembly on the subject of the Jewish question related themselves mainly to the Jays of Alsace. The 19th century had already witnessed some important changes in the relationship between the state and Jewry. In England, the Jays had achieved emancipation de facto, if not de jure. This was helped by the small number of Jays in Britain and the non ideological approach of the British government. It was a different matter on the continent where a more ideological approach prevailed. In 1782, the Masonic Austrian Emperor Joseph II published his Toleraz patent. I don't know how to say that. The purpose was that, quote, of all subjects without distinction of nationality and religion, once they had been admitted and tolerated in our state, shall participate in common public welfare. shall enjoy legal freedom and encounter no obstacles to any honest way of gaining their livelihood and of increasing general industriousness. Existing laws pertaining to the Jewish nation are not always compatible with these, our most gracious intentions. End quote. Most restrictions on the Jays were removed, but these new freedoms applied only to the quote privileged Jay. That is, the Jay from whom the state found useful in some way, and not the quote foreign Jay. Moreover, even privileged Jays were not granted the full right of citizenship and craft mastership. For Joseph wanted to grant tolerance to the Jays, but no, not full equality. So there's a reason for that, though, and a lot of people don't understand that. They think, well, why can't these people have equal rights? What's wrong with that? Well, like in the words of Tsar Nicholas II, he told Rothschild in Dunkirk in 1901, the Russian people are very trusting, and in no matter of a time, they would fall into the trap of the Jayish cabal, which happened. You know, it happened anyways. And as you see, there's a distinction that's being made. It's not the common J, you know, that's doing this. It's organized Jery, It's like, and what is that? You know, that's something to do. It's like a mafia, It's like um, these people get together, and there's a revolutionary spirit that's behind them, and they rally people to get behind their ideas. But that happened in biblical times as well. I mean, if you think about it, who rallied the people to crucify Christ? This was the Sanhedrin, and in the same way, there's always been some form of Sanhedrin that gathers together and plots a revolutionary act. Um, and I think that's what, if you look into what the protocols of Zion are, I think that's really what it is. And then there's some that say, well, maybe that was just to radicalize people, against them, to pit them against them, to have this, to justification of painting themselves as victims. And I think there's a little bit of that going on as well. I think that's why it's depicted so, I guess, in your face. But I think there's a reality to the fact that, yeah, I think I'll read something I found from this book. I think this person's a Roman Catholic. And I sent it to a friend, but I'll read that now. So, okay, so we're going to talk about Freemasonry for a second. So you mentioned the role of Freemasonry in the rise of secularism. Have you studied it? This is what I think this Roman Catholic priest says. He says, a bit. There are a number of solid scholarly studies on Masonry, such as Henry Dallas's La Conjuration, Anti Cheratine. I don't know how to say that. It's a remarkable subtitle, Le Temple Mechanique. I don't know. This is French, so I'm not reading that part of this. Can you say more about he's just listing off books that he's read uh, about Freemasonry and its role in secularism. Can you say more about the place Freemasonry occupied in the secularist movement? Freemasonry is a movement which has philosophical connections with English deism. As said before, according to deism, God has nothing to do with us, so we're completely free. This was in some way the mental premise for the traditional Freemasons as we know them. At the same time, Freemasonry is a kind of religion. We cannot forget this. At the heart of Freemasonry is a religion, a cult, a worship. Is it Satanism? Alas, ultimately it is close to Satanism. Not every Masonic group is satanic, but the roots are satanic and lead to Satanism in the highest degrees of Masonry. Freemasonry is ultimately a Gnostic religion. Gnosticism was flourishing at the time of our Lord Jesus Christ, precisely in the 1st and 2nd centuries in the Greco-Roman world. This movement is characterized by a belief in imaginary intellectual entities, divorced from the evidence of concrete reality and denying a true, supernatural, and historical based divine revelation. The Gnostic mythology was purely man made creation and was destined for an esoteric elite, not for all people. The Gnostic system offered an answer to the two basic questions asked by every human being. Where does evil come from? That is, why does evil exist? And how can I be saved? Gnosticism presented these two basic questions and concerns, the question of evil and the question of salvation, in a fascinating religious system. Gnosticism's solution was simplistic. It says that evil exists in us and outside of us, that we observe evil in nature and in the natural catastrophes, for example, in diseases and so on. Gnostics draw the conclusion that every created visible nature, our body, and the sexuality, for example, must be evil. They say that the creator of visible things is evil, the evil God, and so they postulate an eternal and metaphysical principle of evil. But on the other side, there's also the good. According to Gnostics, since the visible things we observe are evil, there is to be a principle of good, which must therefore be invisible. All that is invisible is good, they say, while all that is visible is a sign of or indicator of evil. Gnostics ask, how do we know that God is the creator? We know it from the Bible, they say. In the Bible is written that God created man and the entire visible universe, and that God created man and woman, two biological sexes, and God said, quote, this is very good. The Gnostics therefore declare that God of the Bible is the evil one, and that all that is written in the Bible as being good is actually evil, and is not good. For the Gnostics, the human body and the two biological sexes are especially an evil. So the Gnostics perverted the meaning of divine revelation in the Bible and turned it into the opposite. They perverted the obvious sense of the biblical affirmation. For example, when God gave the Ten Commandments, he said, quote, you shall not commit adultery. They say this is a lie, that this comes from the evil God, and that the true sense is actually it is good to commit adultery. When God says, quote, you shall not lie, the Gnostics say, no, you can lie when it is good for you. Quote, you shall not murder. The Gnostics say to murder can be good, because the evil God in the Bible gave prohibitions against murder. Thus we see how diabolical Gnostic ideology is. According to Gnosticism, there are two co-eternal principles of good and evil, and they constitute a metaphysical dualism. The good God is in your mind is invisible. The better a thinker you are, the more beautiful you can come up with theories, the closer you are to the good God. Gnosis means, quote, knowledge in Greek. The more knowledge you have in your mind, the more secrets you know, the better. This elite circle of the Gnostic groups claim to have access to knowledge of the good God, and yet not know through revelation in the Bible. Yet not through revelation in the Bible. Ultimately, for Gnostics, the one whom the Bible calls the, quote, devil is the good God. These main elements of the Gnostic system are the basic principles of the religion of Freemasonry. The Masons took the main part of their thinking from historical Gnosticism. But he also said that Freemasonry involves worship. No religious group can exist without a cult, without worship. Freemasonry took their cult, their worship from esoteric groups, especially from the Jewish esoteric Kabbalah groups. Thus, the entire symbolism and terminology of Freemasonry is religiously Jewish and philosophically Gnostic. They took their symbolism and terminology from the Old Testament, and so they imitate parts of Judaism, but is Gnostic because Gnosis says that the Old Testament we read is from the evil God. Therefore, they borrow the same terminology from the Old Testament, the building of the temple and so on, but they say, quote, we are building a new temple, not the visible carnal one, which is from the evil God. We, the Freemasons, are the spiritual and free and independent Masons. We are completely free from the God of the Bible. We have to ask, from who are the Masons free? They declare themselves free from the true God. They say, quote, "Our God is the great architect of the world, this unknown good God whom we do not know, but we are his instruments, and we're building up a new temple of humanity." The Freemasons do this through the use of symbolism and worship, especially with an intellectual program that must be implemented and reflected throughout the whole of human society. In the new temple of Freemasons, man will be placed in the center, and his will be declared God. But in this letter to the Thessalonians, St. Paul said of the Antichrist, quote, he opposes and exalts himself against everything so-called God or object of worship. So he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. This is 2 Thessalonians 2 and 4. This is the Antichrist. In building up this new temple of humanity, Freemasons consider themselves to be the elect ones. This is the complete opposite of divine revelation in the Bible, and especially the Gospel. Freemasonry's goal is to demonstrate that in the end, man is God, that man is the one who determines what is good and what is evil. Abortion, gender ideology, and systematic and demagogic manipulations of the truth in the mass media, for example, correspond to the basic theoretical principles of Freemasonry. Insofar, they are Gnostics. As we said before, Gnostics believe that the prohibition against murder and lying and the creation of two biological sexes are evil, and that the contrary of them is good. So abortion, lying, homosexuality, androgynous, I can't say this, androgynous, I can't say it, whatever, as it was called in Gnosticism, are good according to the Masonic ideology and policy. They're somehow whatever. They are somehow influencing masses to unknowingly build a Masonic temple. All these elements which contradict human reason, the revelation of the true God, whom Freemasonry considers the evil God, are for them the ideological stones for building the so-called new temple of humanity. In building the new temple of humanity, the first step is to eliminate Christianity. Since Christianity is essentially supernatural, theocentric, and Christocentric, and not essentially natural and anthropocentric. In Christianity, Christ, his word and his truth is at the center. To eliminate Christianity is the first and last goal of Freemasonry. To eliminate Christ as God, as the incarnate God and Savior. Freemasons would tolerate a purely human Christ as a good teacher, on the same level with Muhammad and Buddha, for example. Today it's very dangerous to speak only about God and not about Christ as the true God. Humanists and Masonic ideologies seek to erect this new temple, and they call this the quote progress of humanity. In this process of progress, man is put at the center, not Christ. Next, natural marriage and family have to be eliminated, and their sense perverted, because according to the Gnostics and Freemasons, the evil God, as they say, created marriage between one man and one woman. It was Freemasonry which introduced divorce legislation in Europe. The person asks, "How do you know this?" He says, "It has been documented." The Freemasons themselves declare this and are proud that they initiated divorce and abortion legislation, for example. Have you seen these documents? There are studies and books on which this is all documented. The Freemasons themselves have issued statements, for example, in the supplement of the French newspaper Le Figaro from July 20th through the 21st, 2012, to eliminate the family, you start with divorce. Then there is, quote, free love, feminism, contraception, and so on. According to this logic, you become the Lord of life. By using contraception in some sense of a couple is putting God as their service rather than placing themselves at his service in the transmission of life, putting him at the center of their life and love. We want a baby, God has to be at our service, and when we don't, we use contraception. Exactly, this is anthropocentrism. Anthropocentrism. Again, man is at the center, not God. Um, So this anthropocentrism is the heart of Freemasonry and the work of building the new temple of humanity and penetrating all social realities. However, Freemasonry's chief aim is to penetrate the church from inside. Freemasons tried to eliminate the church during the French Revolution in a cruel and barbaric way. However, they saw this produce a stronger church through martyrdom. Some argue that Freemasons had a hand in the formulation of the Soviet Union, and their role in preparing the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 is not acknowledged by some historians who have studied this question. When did Freemasonry begin? It officially began in London in 1717. The statutes of the Masonic Lodge in London were written by a Protestant pastor named James Anderson. Freemasonry gained political power through and after the French Revolution, and its lodges prepared the various revolutions in the 19th century. Today, Freemasonry openly acknowledges the French Revolution as its work. In the chambers of the Deputy of Paris during the sessions on July 1st, 1904, the Marquis de Rosambeau stated, quote, Freemasonry has worked in a hidden but constant manner to prepare the revolution. We are then in complete agreement on the point that Freemasonry was the only author of the revolution, and the applause which I received from the left, and which into I am little accustomed, proves, gentlemen, that you acknowledge with me that it was Freemasonry which made the French Revolution. End quote. To which Mr. Jamel answered, quote, we do more than acknowledge it, we proclaim it. Vladimir Lenin, for example, was also a member of a Freemasonic lodge. The Prime Minister of Russia, Kerensky, was also a known member of the Russian Freemasonic Orient. He had the Tsar deposed and established a civil government. It was the Russian Freemasons who deposed the Tsar in 1917. The first civil government from February to the October Revolution was substantially a Masonic government. The Freemason Kerensky prepared the way for Lenin. How did Lenin come on the scene? He was already a member of the number of terrorist groups and aligned with the communists. However, he received his entire logical support from the Masonic government in Russia itself, from Kerensky, and from the Masons in Europe, especially in Germany. The German government brought him in a private railway car to Petersburg to start the revolution. The Freemasons wanted to carry out an experiment with the chaotic communists through the establishment of a completely atheistic society, and they succeeded. However, in that period of the Soviet communism, the natural law was not obliterated. Current day gender ideologies would be unimaginable, as was, quote, same sex marriage. During communist times in Russia, it would have been absurd to promote the homosexual agenda. In the Soviet Union, if you committed homosexual acts, you were persecuted or punished. Okay, so uh, that's one aspect of it. I think what we're looking at is sort of a zeitgeist. The antichrist spirit throughout the ages sort of influences revolt. It's a lawless. Okay, well, I don't Okay, so I'm back. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the link in the chat. If anybody wants to come up here, you can. If you don't want to, that's also fine. So, but yeah, like as I was talking about, I think it's, the antichrist spirit is a revolutionary spirit. It's a lawless spirit, you know, and the Gnostics go back to the early Nicolaitans, Simonian ideology. Simon Magus, who tried to buy the Holy Spirit. These type of people had always been, you know, sort of um, around the church in some way. The Arians are a form of Gnosticism. Um, so it's always been the chief enemy of the church, a perversion of church teachings, and you know, just satanic. So we're gonna go back to this Moss article. I want to give a bit of context to, I guess, what I'm going over today. So he says, as it was a different matter of the continent where a more ideological approach prevailed in 1782. The Masonic Austrian Emperor Joseph II. Okay, we read that. So let's go down here a little bit. As for France, already in 1784, the Jays of Bordeaux had been accorded further concessions by Louis XVI in 1776. All of the Portuguese Jays had been given religious liberty and the permission to inhabit all parts of the kingdom. The decree of January 28, 1790, conferring on the Jays of Bordeaux the rights of the French citizens, put the finishing touch to this scheme of liberation. The Sephardic Jays of southwest France and Papal Avignon, who were already more assimilated than their Ashkenazi co-religionists in Alsace, were given full citizenship in July 1790, but the proposal to extend this privilege to the Jays of Alsace evoked a storm of controversy in the assembly and also a violent insurrection amongst the Alsace peasants. I want to. I guess I think I need to make this clear too. Is like, I think some people think like, oh, like if you're anti-Zionist, then you're pro-Nazi or something. And I would say I'm not that at all. I think fascism is incompatible with Orthodox Christianity, and I think it's either one of two things that either you know, I mean, Mr. Mustache in Germany was a part of the plot, or he was manipulated and used as a scapegoat to paint the Zionists as kind of like victims in some sense. But I mean, I'm leaning more towards he was an agent provocateur, putting the same people back in some way. At least if that's not true, and then he was of the same spirit, an antichrist spirit. Um, which you can kind of see that in like I got something, I'll go over that later. So, in their first debate on the subject on September 28, 1789, they made a further important distinction between the nation and the individuals constituting the nation. Thus the Stananislas, I don't know what that is, argued that there cannot be a nation without a nation, so that the Jays should be denied everything as a nation but granted everything as individuals. A separate nation of Jays cannot be allowed to exist within France. For virtually all moderates, no less the radicals, uh, the Dantonists, no less uh, Robespierre's. I don't know how to say that. Christians, as well as deists, pantheists, and atheists, held that the equality of status in the state where they were, in various ways intent on establishing, was bound up of the necessity with the elimination of all groups, classes, or cooperations, intermediate, and therefore mediating between the state itself and the citizen. Vitale writes, quote, The immediate issue before the assembly was the administration of certain pariah classes, among them actors and public executioners, to what came to be termed, quote, active citizenship. It was soon apparent, however, that the issues presented by the Jays were very different. It was apparent, too, that it would make no sense to examine the Jays' case in tandem with that of the Protestants. The latter, like the Jays, were non-Catholics, but their national identity was not in doubt, not, nor therefore their right to the new liberties being decreed for all. Whatever else they were Frenchmen. No one in the National Assembly thought otherwise. But were the Jays Frenchmen? If they were not, could they become citizens? The contention of the lead speaker in the debate, Count Stanislaw de Clermont-Tonnerre, was that the argument for granting them full rights of citizenship needed to be founded on the most general principles. Religion was a private affair. The law of the state needed not and ought to impinge upon it. So long as religious obligations were compatible with the law of the state and contravened in it no particular, it was wrong to deprive a person whose conscience required him to assume such religious obligations of those rights, which it was the duty of the citizens to assume. One either imposed a national religion by main force, so erasing the relevant clause of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the citizen to which all now subscribed, or else one allowed everyone the freedom to profess the religious opinion of his choice. Mere tolerance was unacceptable. Quote, the system of tolerance coupled to degrading distinctions is so vicious in itself that he who is compelled to tolerate remains is dissatisfied with the law as is he whom it has granted no more than such a form of tolerance. There is no middle way. The enemies of the Jays attacked them and attacked them. The Claremont Tonnerre on the grounds that they were deficient morally. It was also held of the Jays that they were unsociable, that their laws prescribed usury, that they were forbidden to mix with the French by marriage or at table to join them in defense of the country or any other common enterprise. But these reproaches were either unjust or specious. Usury was blameworthy beyond a doubt, but it was the laws of the French that had compelled the Jays to practice it. And so, with most of the other charges, once the Jays had title to the land, a country of their own, the practice of usury would cease. So would the unsociability that was held against them. So would much of their religious eccentricity. As for the further argument that they had judges and laws of their own, why, so did, and on this matter he, Claremont Tonnerre, would say to his critics, coming to the passage in his address to the Assembly, that would be quoted over and over again in the course of the 2 centuries that followed, that indeed was impermissible. Quote, a nation of the Jays must be denied everything. As individuals, they must be granted everything. Their judges can no longer be recognized. Their recourse must be on our own exclusively legal protection for the doubtful laws by which Jay's corporate existence is maintained must end. They cannot be allowed to create a political body or a separate order within the state. It is necessary that they be citizens individually. See, I think that's really like the problematic issue is like you have a group of people that kind of want to create their own state within your country, and then like they start radicalizing people and like controlling the media and doing weird stuff. Like it's not good, you know. And then like no matter what you say, you're always going to be painted in this like really negative light if you say anything about them. Um, it becomes kind of a really manipulative situation. That's for sure. And I'm not saying like every other person in the world is just like an angel or something compared to these people or something, but you got to admit it's problematic. Quote: there remains the question, what if, as some argued, it was the case that the Jays themselves had no interest in citizenship? Why in that case, he went on, quote, if they do not want it, let them say so, in which case expel them. The idea of a society of non-citizens within the state of a nation within a nation was repugnant to him. But in fact, the speaker concluded that was not all what the Jays wanted. The evidence was to the contrary. They wished to be incorporated into the nation of France. Fair enough. Okay. Clermont Tonnerre was promptly contradicted on this last vital point by Abbé Mouret. The term Jay, said the Abbé, did not denote a religious sect but a nation, one which had laws which it had always followed, and by which it wished to continue to abide. To proclaim the Jay citizens could be, as it is to say, without letter or naturalization, without ceasing to be English or Danish, Englishmen or Danes could become Frenchmen. Excuse me. But Moore's chief argument was of a moral and social order. The Jays were inherently undesirably socially as well as economically. They had been chased out of France and then recalled no less than 7 times. Chased out by avarice, as Voltaire had rightly put it, readmitted by the avarice once more, but in foolishness as well. The Jays had always had passed 17 centuries without mingling with the other nations. They had never engaged in anything but trade and money. They had been the plague of the agricultural provinces. Not one of them has ever dignified his hands by driving a plow. Their laws leave them no time for agriculture. The Sabbath apart, they celebrate 56 more festivals than the Christians in each year. In Poland, they possess an entire province. Well then, while the sweat of Christian slaves waters the furrows in which the Jay's opulence germinates, they themselves, as their fields are cultivated, engage in weighing ducats and calculating how much they can shave off the coinage without exposing themselves to legal penalties. Quote, they have never been laborers, Maury continued, not even under David and Solomon, and even then they were notorious for their laziness. Their sole concern was commerce. Would you make soldiers of them? That the Abbe asked, or Abba, maybe? Abbe? I don't know. If you did, you would derive small benefit from them. They have a horror of celibacy, and they marry young. He knew of no general who would wish to command an army of jays either on the Sabbath, a day on which they never gave battle, or indeed at any other time, or did the assembly imagine that they could make craftsmen of them, when their many festivals and Sabbath days presented an insurmountable obstacle to such an enterprise. The Jays held 12 million mortgages in Alsace alone. He informed his colleagues within a month of their being granted citizenship, they would own half the province outright. In 10 years' time, they would have conquered all of it, reducing it to nothing more than a Jayish colony, upon which the hatred of the people of Alsace already bore for the Jays would explode. It was not that he, Maury, wish the Jays to be persecuted. They are men, they are our brothers, anathema on whoever speaks of intolerance, nor need their religious opinions disturb anyone. He joined all others in agreeing that they were to be protected, but they did not mean that they could be citizens. It was as individuals that they were entitled to protection, not as Frenchmen. Um, okay, so yeah, your blessing, Father Antonius. Okay, so I'm going to continue with this. See where it goes. I don't know where he's going with it. I haven't read this before. Robespierre took the opposite line, supporting Clermont Tonnerre. I don't know how to say this person's name either. I always pick like these articles about with names I can't pronounce. All who fulfilled the generally applicable conditions of eligibility to citizenship were entitled to the rights deprived from it. He argued, including the right to hold public office, and so far the facts were concerned, much of what Maury had said about the Jays were infinitely exaggerated and contrary to known history. Moreover, to the charge of the Jays themselves with responsibility for their own persecution at the hands of others was absurd. Quote, vices are imputed to them. But to whom should these vices be imputed, if not to ourselves for our injustice? Let us restore them to happiness, to country, uh, and to virtue by restoring them to the dignity of men and citizens. Let us reflect that it can never be politic, whatever anyone might say, to condemn a multitude of men who live among us to degradation and oppression. Thus spoke the man who was soon to lead the most degrading and oppressive regime in European history to that date. Indeed, it is striking how those who spoke most fervently for the Jays, apart from leading the Jays community, such as the banker Sir Beer and Isaac Beer, were Freemasons or Illuminati. Thus, in the 2 years before the crucial debate on September 27th, 1791, you know what's so funny about reading stuff like this is like at that time, or I mean, just reading that, like, oh, these two guys that were saying all this stuff, they were both Freemasons and Illuminati. And, if you say that now, like somebody's a Freemason or he's in the Illuminati, like it's instantly dismissed. And, I think that's because there's been a propagation of absurdity and guessing and all this other stuff, and people really don't have, like, I guess, the facts about these organizations. So even when you do hear facts about it, like it's almost like we've been brainwashed to turn our brains off and say, "Oh, that's just a conspiracy or something," um, which a lot of times it's not a case, especially with something like this. Like, I try to find material that's actually true. Um, And sure, I'm sure I've found things that weren't so true too, but I try to discern what is and what isn't. Thus, in the 2 years before the crucial debate on September 27, 1791, writes General Nekvolodov, quote, 14 attempts were made to give the Jays civic equality, and 35 major speeches were given by several orators, among them Mirabeau, Robespierre, Abbe Gregory, Abbe Sissiev, uh, Kimele, Desmoulins, Vernier, Barniev, Lameth, Deporte, and others. Quote, now there is a singular comparison to be made, says Abbe Leman. All the names which we have just cited and which figure in the Montier as having voted for the Jays are also found on the list of Masons. Is this a coincidence, not proof of the order given in the lodges of Paris to work in favor of Jayist emancipation? Yet, in spite of the revolutionary spirit, the National Assembly was very little inclined to give equality of civic rights to the Jays. Against this reform, there rose up all the deputies from Alsace, since it was in Alsace that the majority of the French Jays at that time lived. But this opposition in the National Assembly did not stop the Jays to attain their end. They employed absolutely every means. According to Abbe Lemaine, these means were the following. Quote, first means uh, entreaty, a charm exercised over several presidents of the Assembly. Second, the influence of gold. Third, the means of logic. After the National Assembly had declared the rights of man, the Jays insisted that these rights should be logically be applied to them, and they set out their ideas on the subject with an implacable arrogance. Fourth means resource to the suburbs and the Paris Commune, so as to force the National Assembly under threat of violence to give the Jays equality. One of their most thorough historians, Griette, says Abbe Lemaine, did not feel that he had to hide his maneuver. Exhausted, he said, by thousands of useful efforts they had to made to obtain civil rights, they thought up a last means, seeing that it was impossible to obtain by reason and common sense what they called their rights. They resolved to force the National Assembly to approve of their emancipation. Quote, to this end, naturally, every expended vast sums which served to establish the Christian front which they wanted. Quote, in the session of the National Assembly of January 18th, 1791, the Duke de Brogomel expressed himself completely openly on this subject. Among them, he said, there is one in particular who has acquired an immense fortune at the expense of the state, and who is spending in the town of Paris considerable sums to win supporters of his cause. He meant Sheriff Bear. See, the Surf Bear, I think it's a Cerfbeer. At the head of the Christian front created on this occasion were the lawyer Goddard and three ecclesiastics, the Abbe Mulot, Berthelot, and Fauchet. Abbe Fauchet was a well-known Illuminist, and Abbe Mulot, the president of the all-powerful Paris Commune, with the help of which the Jacobins exerted, in the time desired, the necessary pressure of the national and legislative assemblies, and later on the convention. What Gregory Cure Imbermel was for the Jays is the heart of National Assembly. Abbe Mulot was in the heart of the Commune. Quote, however, although they were fanatical Jacobins, the members of the Commune were far from agreeing to the proposition of their president that they act in defense of Jewish rights in the National Assembly. It was necessary to return constantly to the attack, naturally with the powerful help of Sir Bear's gold and that of Abbe Fauchet and Bertoliot. 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 I don't know. This later declared during a session of the Commune on the question, it was necessary that a happy and unexpected event as the revolution should come and rejuvenate France. Let us hasten to consign to oblivion the crimes of our fathers. I'm starting to see a pattern here, I think, throughout history. It's like in Russia, it was like, we want equal rights. In France, we want equal rights. And then it's using this to sort of manipulate and eventually like take over the country. I think that's what's going on here. Then during another session, the lawyer Godard busted into the chamber with 50 armed patriots dressed in costumes of the National Guard or three colored cockades. They were 50 EJs who, naturally provided with money, had made the rounds of the section of the Paris Commune and of the ward of the town of Paris, talking about recruiting partisans of the equality for the Jays. This had its effect. Out of the 50 sections of the Paris, 59 declared themselves for equality. Only the Courtier des Halles abstained. Then the Commune addressed the National Assembly with an appeal signed by Abbe Boulot, Beralot, Fauchet, and other members demanding that equality be immediately given to the Jays. Quote, however, even after that, the National Assembly hesitated in declaring itself in the manner provided. Then on September 27th, the day of the penultimate session of the Assembly before its dissolution, the Jacobin deputy Adrien Duport posed the question of equality for the Jays in a categorical fashion. The Assembly knew Adrien Duport's personality perfectly. It knew that in a secret meeting of the chiefs of Freemasonry, which preceded the revolution, he had insisted on the necessity of a resort to a system of terror. The Assembly yielded. There followed a decree signed by Louis XVI granting French Jays full and complete equality of rights. However, as many had feared, emancipation created problems. In the late 1790s, a new wave of Ashkenazis entered France from Germany. Attracted by the superior status their emancipated French brothers now enjoyed, this was to lead to the further disturbance in Alsace, which it was left to Napoleon to deal with. Quote, nevertheless, as Paul Johnson writes, quote, the deed was done. French Jays were now free, and the clock could never be turned back. Moreover, emancipation in some form took place wherever the French were able to carry the revolutionary spirit with their arms. The ghettos and the Jays' close quarters were broken into the papal Avignon in 1791, Nice in 1792, and Rhineland in 1792 to 3. The spread of the revolution to the Netherlands and the founding of the Batavian Republic led to the Jays being granted full and formal rights by law there. 1796. In 1796-8, Napoleon Bonaparte liberated many of the Italian ghettos. French troops, young jays, and local enthusiasts tearing down their crumbling old walls. Quote, for the time, a new archetype, which had always existed in the embryonic form, began to emerge from the shadows. The revolutionary jay, clericalist in Italy, swore enmity to Gauls, Jacobins, and Jays. In 1793-4, Jewish Jacobins set up a revolutionary regime in Saint Esprit, the Jewish suburb of Bayonne. Once again, as during the Reformation, and traditionally saw a sinister link between the Torah and subversion, or more precisely, the Talmud and subversion. For it was not the Torah that taught the Jays to rebel perpetually against all Gentile power. It was the Talmud, with its institutionalized hatred of all non-Jays. Civil war among the Masons. Okay, so we're going to the Civil War among the Masons now. We've seen that the emancipation of the Jays in 1789-91 was carried out chiefly by the Freemasons. This is hardly surprising, given the Jayist nature of the central Masonic myth and rites. Judaism and Freemasonry are interrelated and interdependent. The first stage of the revolution, from 1789 to 1791, was dominated by the Masons, whose numbers had grown at an astonishing rate in the pre-revolutionary years. Adam Zomosky writes that, quote, there were 104 lodges in France in 1772, 198 by 1776, and a staggering 629 by 1789. Their membership included virtually every writer, artist, lawyer, soldier, or other professional in the country, as well as notable foreigners such as the Franklin and Jefferson, some 30,000 people. Quote, between 800 and 900 Masonic lodges, writes Doyle, quote, were founded in France between 1732 and 1793, two-thirds of them after 1760. Between 1773 and 1779, well over 20,000 members were recruited. Few towns of any consequence were without one or more lodges by the 1780s, and despite several papal condemnations of the deistic cult that had originated in Protestant England, the elite of society flocked to join. Voltaire was drafted in on the last visit to Paris, and it was before the Assembly Brethren of the Nine Sisters lodge that he exchanged symbolic embrace with Franklin. In 1791, a split began to emerge between the more moderate liberal Masons, the great majority who had been responsible for liberal reforms like the Declaration of Rights of Man, and a more violent and revolutionary minority. The split was reflected in the composition of convention elected in 1792. It was divided between the the Jacobins on the left, led by Marat and Dayton, and Robespierre and the Parisians delegates, and the Girondins on the right, led by Beresford, Verginaud, and the faction of the Gironde. I don't know how to say that. Gironde. The Jacobins were identified with the interests of the Paris mob and the most radical ideas of the revolution. The Girondins with the interests of the province and the original liberal ideas of 1789. The Montagnards stood for disposing the king as soon as possible. The Girondins wanted a referendum of the whole people to decide. Okay. The Montagnard Saint Just said that a trial was unnecessary, that people had already judged the king on August 10th, It remained only to punish him. For there is no innocent reign. Every king is a rebel and a usurper. Robespierre had voted against the death penalty in the assembly, but now he said that Louis must die and the country must live. An unconscious echo of the words of Caiaphas about Christ. Caiaphas about Christ. Quote, "It is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and the whole nation perish not." John 11:50. And he agreed with St. Just, quote, "Louis cannot be judged, he has already been judged. He has been condemned, or else the Republic is not blameless. To suggest putting Louis on trial in whatever way is a step towards royals and constitutional despotism. It is a counter-revolutionary idea because it puts the revolution itself in the dock. After all, if Louis can still be put on trial, Louis can be acquitted. He might be innocent, or rather he is presumed to be until he is found guilty. But if Louis can be presumed innocent, what becomes of the revolution?" There was a certain logic in these words, since the revolution undermined all the foundations of the ancient regime. The possibility that the head of the regime might be innocent implied the revolution might be guilty. So, quote, "revolutionary justice required straight execution rather than a trial. It could not afford to question the foundations of revolution itself. It was the same logic that led to the execution without trial of Tsar Nicholas II in 1918. But the thinking of the majority of the deputies were not yet, quote, advanced in their thinking as Robespierre. So during the third week of January 1793, writes Jasper Ridley, quote, "the convention voted 4 times on the issue. A resolution finding Louis guilty of treason and rejecting the idea of an appeal to the people by um, plebiscite. So much for uh, Rousseauist democracy. Was carried by 426 votes to 278, and the decision to impose the death penalty was carried out by 387 to 314. Philippe Egalite, the Duke of Orleans and cousin of the king, who became the Grand Master of the Masons, then a Jacobin, renouncing his title for the name Philippe Egalite, voted to convict Louis and for the death penalty. A deputy then proposed that the question on what to do with Louis should be postponed indefinitely. This was defeated by 361 to 360, a single vote. Felipe Egalit voted against the proposal, so his vote decided to issue on 20 January a resolution that the death sentence should be immediately carried out, uh, was passed by 380 to 310, and Louis was guillotined the next day. Now the Jacobins cast the Girondins aside. A coup against the Girondist deputies was carried out between May 31st, June 2nd, 1793. Quote, "In July 1793, writes Jasper Ridley, quote, a young Girondin woman, Charlotte Corday, gained admission to Marat's house by pretending that she wished to give him a list of names of Girondins to be guillotined. She found him sitting as usual in the bath to cure his skin disease, and she stabbed him to death. She was guillotined, and the Girondin party was suppressed. And Lyons, Girondins had gained control of the Freemasonic lodges in the September of 1793. The Girondins there defied the authority of the Jacobin government in Paris and guillotined one of the local Jacobin leaders. The Lyons Freemasons played a leading part in the rising against the Paris Jacobins, but the Jacobins suppressed by revolt, and several of the leading Girondin Freemasons of Lyons were guillotined. The revolutionary government now took terrible revenge on its defeated enemies. On October 12th, the committee voted, quote, moved a decree that Lyons should be destroyed. Its very name was to disappear, except on a monument and among the ruins, which would proclaim, Lyons made war on liberty. Lyons is no more. Lyons was not completely destroyed, but whole ranges of houses were burnt and thousands were guillotined and shot. The effect was designed to be a salutary one. what cement for the revolution gloated a card in a letter to Paris. And so the revolution was frenziedly devouring its own children. Or rather, the Masons were devouring their own brothers, for the struggle between Girondists and the Montagnards was, in fact, according to Lev Tikhomarov, a struggle between different layers of Masonry. Quote, in the period of the terror, the majority of the Masonic lodges were closed. As Louis Blanc explained, a significant number of Masons, though extremely liberal-minded, could still not, in accordance with their personal interests, character, and public position, sympathize with the incitement of the maddened masses against the rich to whom they themselves belonged. In the hottest battle of the Revolution, it was those who split off into the highest degrees who acted. The Masonic lodges were replaced by political clubs, although in the political clubs too there began a shifting of the revolutionaries and more moderate and the extremists, so that quite a few Masons perished on the scaffolds from the hands of their quote brothers. After the overthrow of Robespierre and the Thermidor, the Masonic lodges were again opened. O.F. Soloviev writes, quote, the brotherhoods were considered outposts of counter-revolution. Many disbanded themselves, some members immigrated, others stopped all work. Only after the coming to power of Napoleon, who protected the order, was it actively renewed and even broadened. Okay, so now we're to the Jacobins and the Illuminati. So let's see what's going on. If we look into the origins of Jacobinism, then we will soon come up against the name of the organization called Illuminism, founded on May 1st, 1776 by a Bavarian professor called Weishaupt, who assumed the name of Spartacus from the slave who rebelled against Rome in the 1st century BC. Illuminism arose out of the dissatisfaction of a group of Masons with the general state of Masonry. Thus, another founder, Count Mirabeau, noted in the same year of 1776 the lodge Theodor de Bon Conseil at Munich, where there was a few men with brains and hearts which tried of being tossed about by the vain promises and quarrels of masonry, their heads resolved to graft onto their branch another secret association to which they gave the name of the Order of the Lumines. They modeled it on the Society of Jesus, who are proposing to themselves something diametrically opposed. Quote, our strength, wrote Weishaupt, lies in secrecy. Therefore we must, without hesitation, use as a cover some innocent societies. The lodges of blue masonry are a fitting veil to hide our real aims. Since the world is accustomed to expecting nothing important or constructive from them, their ceremonies are considered petty trifles for the amusement of big children. The name of the learned society is also a magnificent mask behind which we can hide our lower degrees. Quote, Weishaupt constructed his organization on several levels, revealing his most radical plans only to his chosen co-workers. Weishaupt chose the members of his organization mainly amidst young people, carefully studying each candidate. Quote, having sifted out the unreliable and dubious, the leaders of the order performed on the rest of the rite of consecration, which took place at a 3-day fast in a dark basement. Every candidate was consecrated separately, having first had its arms and legs bound. Then from various corners of the dark basement, the most unexpected questions were showered upon the initiate. Quote, having replied to the questions, he swore absolute obedience to the leaders of the order. Every new member signed that he would preserve the secrets of the organization under fear of the death penalty. However, the newcomer was not yet considered to be a full member of the organization, but received the status of novice, and for 1 to 3 months had to be under the observation of an experienced alumni. He was told to keep a special diary and regularly present it to the leaders. The novice filled it in numerous questionnaires and also prepared monthly accounts of all matters linking him with the order. Having passed through all the trials, the novice underwent a second initiation, now as a fully fledged member. Quote, after his initiation, the new member was given a distinguishing sign, a gesture and password, which changed depending on the rank he occupied. Quote, the newcomer received a special pseudonym, order's name, usually borrowed from ancient history, and got to know an ancient Parisian method of timekeeping, the geography of the order, and also a secret code, quote, Weishaupt imposed into the order a system of global spying and mutual tailing. Quote, most of the members were at the lowest level of the hierarchy. Quote, no less than 1,000 people would enter the organization, but for conspiratorial purposes, each member knew only a few people. As Weishaupt himself noted, directly under me there are two who are completely inspired by myself, while under each of them are two, etc. Thus I can stir up and put into motion 1,000 people. This is how one commands and acts in politics. Quote, do you realize sufficiently, he wrote in the discourse, the reception of the Illuminatus Dirigens, quote, what it means to rule in a secret society, not only over the lesser and more important of the populace, but over the best men, over men of all ranks and nations and religions, to rule without external force, to unite them indissolubly, to breathe one spirit and soul in them, men distributed over all parts of the world. The supposed aim of the new order was to improve the present system of government and to abolish the, quote, slavery of the peasants, the servitude of men in the soil, the rights of the main mort, and all customs and privileges which abase humanity. The corvées under condition of an equivalent, all the corporations and the matrices, all the burdens imposed on industry and commerce by customs, exercise duties and taxes to procure a universal toleration for all religious opinions, to take away all the arms of superstitions, to favor the liberty of press, etc. This was almost exactly the same program as that carried out by the Constituent Assembly at the beginning of the French Revolution in 1789 through 91, under the leadership of, among others, the same court, Mirabeau, a remarkable coincidence. However, this liberal democratic program was soon forgotten when Weishaupt took over the order, for, quote, Spartacus had elaborated a much more radical program, a program that was to resemble the socialism of the latter, more radical stages of the revolution. Weishaupt had made into an absolute theory the misanthropic Gibbs boutades of Rousseau at the invention of property in society, and without taking into account the statement so distinctly formulated by Rousseau on the impossibility of suppressing property in society once they had been established, he proposed as the end of Illuminism the abolition of property, social authority, of nationality, and the return of human race to a happy state in which it formed only a single family without artificial needs, without useless science, every father being priest and magistrate, priest of we know not what religion, for in spite of their frequent invocations of the God of nature, many indications lead us to conclude that Weishaupt had, like Diderot and de Holbach, no other god than nature herself. Okay. Weishaupt proceeded to create an inner secret circle within Masonry. He used the religious forms of Masonry and invented a few, quote, mysteries himself, but his aim was to found a political organization controlled by himself. His political theory, according to Webster, was, quote, no other than that of modern anarchy, that man should govern himself and the ruler shall be gradually done away with. But he carefully to deprecate all ideas of violent revolution, the process to be accompanied by most peaceful methods. Let us see how gently he leads to the final conclusion. Quote, The first stage in life of the whole human race is savagery, rough nature, in which the family is the only society, and hunger and thirst are easily satisfied, in which man enjoys the two most excellent goods, equality and liberty, to their fullest extent. In these circumstances, health was his usual condition. Happy men who are not yet enough enlightened to lose their peace of mind to be conscious of the unhappy mainsprings and causes of misery, love of power, envy, illness, and all the results of imagination. The manner in which man fell from this primitive state of felicity is then described. Quote, as families increased, means of subsistence began to lack, and nomadic life ceased, property was instituted. Men established themselves firmly through agriculture, families drew near each other, thereby languages developed, and through living together men began to measure themselves against each other, etc. But here was the cause of the downfall of freedom. Equality vanished. Man felt new, unknown needs. Quote, thus men became dependent like minors on their guardianship of kings. The human must to attain to a majority and become self-governing. Quote, why should it be impossible that the human race should obtain to its highest perfection the capacity to guide itself? Why should anyone be eternally led who understands how to lead himself? Quote, further, men must learn not only to be independent of kings, but of each other. Quote, who has need of another depends on him and has resigned his right, so to need little is the first step to freedom. Therefore, savages and the most highly enlightened are perhaps the only free men. The art of more and more limiting one needs at the same time the art of attaining freedom. Weishaupt then goes on to show how the further evil of patriotism arose. Quote, with the origin of nations and peoples, the world ceased to be a great family, a single kingdom. The great ties of nature were torn. Nationalism took the place of human love. Now it becomes a virtue to magnifying one's fatherland at the expense of whoever was not enclosed within its limits. Now, as a means to this narrow end, it was allowed to despise and outwit foreigners, or indeed even to insult them. This virtue was called patriotism. Quote, and so by narrowing down affection to one's fellow citizens, the member of one's own family, and even to oneself, quote, there arose out of patriotism localism, the family spirit, and finally egoism. Diminished patriotism, then men will learn to know each other again as such. Their dependence on each other will be lost, the bond of union will widen out. Quote, whilst the ancient religions taught the hope of a redeemer, we should restore man to his former state. Weishaupt looks to man alone for his restoration. Men, he observes, quote, no longer love men, but only such and such men. The word was quite lost. Thus, in Weishaupt's Masonic system, the lost word is man. Its recovery is interpreted by the idea that man should find himself again. Further on, Weishaupt goes on to show how the redemption of the human race is to be brought about. He says, quote, these means are secret symbols of wisdom. There were from all time the archives of nature and of human rights. Through them will men be saved from this fall. Princes and nations will disappear without violence from the earth. The human race will become one family, and the world the abode of reasonable men. Morality alone brings about this change imperceptibly. Every father of a family will be as formerly Abraham and the patriarchs, the priest and the unfettered lord of his family, and reason will be the only code of man. This is one of our greatest secrets. Quote, his first idea was to make fire worship the religion of Luminism. The profession of Christianity, therefore, appears to have been an afterthought. Evidently, Weishaupt discovered, as others have done, that Christianity lends itself more readily to subversive ideas than any other religion. As in the passages which we follow, we find adopting the old ruse uh, representing Christ as a communist and as a secret society adept. Thus, he goes to explain that if Jesus preaches contempt of riches, he wishes to teach us the reasonable use of them and prepare for the community of goods introduced by him, and which Weishaupt add later. He lived with his disciples, but this secret doctrine is only to be apprehended by initiates. Crazy. I guess so, right? Yeah, seems that way. Okay, so Weishaupt thus contrives to give a purely political interpretation of Christ's teaching. Quote, the secret preserved through the disciplinum arcanae and aim appearing through all his words and deeds is to give back to men their original liberty and equality. Now one can understand how far Jesus was the Redeemer and Savior of the world. Quote, the mission of Christ was thereby means of reason to make men capable of freedom. When at last reason becomes the religion of men, so will the problem be solved. Weishaupt goes on to show that Freemasonry can be interpreted in the same manner. The secret doctrine concealed in the teaching of Christ was handed down by initiates who hid themselves in their doctrine under the cover of Freemasonry. In a long explanation of Masonic hieroglyphics, he indicates the analogies between Hiramic legend and the story of Christ. I say that Hiram is Christ. In this manner, Weishaupt demonstrates that Freemasonry is hid in Christianity. But this is, of course, only the secret of Weishaupt calls the real Freemasonry, in contradiction to the official kind, which he regards as totally unenlightened. But the whole religious side of Weishaupt's system is, in fact, really a ruse to attract religious men. Weishaupt himself despised religion. Quote, you cannot imagine, he wrote, quote, what consideration and sensation of priest degrees is arousing. The most wonderful thing is that great Protestant and Reformed theologians who belong to Q Illuminism. It says Q belong to Q Illuminism. Still believe that the religious teachings imparted in it contain the true and genuine spirit of Christian religion. O men, of what can not ye be persuaded? I never thought I should become the founder of the new religion. So this whole Q thing, I think this is a reference to Weishaupt. That's a trip. I'm gonna post this here so someone else can see this. So I'm not tripping. Okay. Only gradually, and only to a very few of his closest associates, did Weishaupt reveal the real purpose of his order, the revolutionary overthrow of the whole of society, civil and religious. Weishaupt had been credited with the founding of world revolution. Elements of all religions and philosophical systems, including Christianity and Masonry, were used by Weishaupt to enroll a body of influential men, about 25,000 at one time, who would obey him in all things while knowing neither him personally nor the real aims of the secret society they had been initiated into. The use of codes and pseudonyms and the pyramidal structure of his organization, whereby nobody on the lower level knew what was happening on the one above his, while those on the higher levels knew everything about what was happening below them, was occupied by all succeeding revolutionary organizers. In 1782, Weishaupt convened a Universal Congress of Illuminati in Williamsbad and was well on the way to taking over Freemasonry. In July 1785, an Illuminatus was struck by lightning, and papers found on him led to the Bavarian government banning the organization. However, both Illuminism and Weishaupt continued in existence. Only France rather than Germany became the center of their operations. Thus, the Parisian Lodge Armis Runius, renamed Enemeris Runus, gathered together all really radical Masons from various other lodges, many of whom were still royalists, and turned them often unconsciously into agents of Weishaupt. These adepts included no less than 30 princes, for it was characteristic of the revolution that among those who were most swept up by the madness of its intoxication were those who stood to lose most from it. Some far-sighted men, such as Apostolic Nuncio in Vienna, Marquis de Luchet warned against Illuminism, and de Luchet predicted almost exactly the course of events that the revolution would take on the basis of his knowledge of the order. But no one paid any attention. But then in October 1789, a pamphlet was seized in the house of the wife of Mirabeau's publisher among Mirabeau's papers and published 2 years later. Mirabeau, maybe. Quote, beginning with a diatribe against the French monarchy, writes Webster, quote, the document goes on to say, in order to triumph over the hydra-headed monster, there are my ideas. Quote, we must overthrow all order, suppress all laws, annul all power, lead the people in anarchy. The law we establish will not perhaps be forced at once, but at any rate, having given back the power to the people, they will resist for the sake of liberty which they will believe they are preserving. We must caress their vanity, flatter their hopes, promise them happiness after our work has been in operation. We must elude in their uh, caprices and their systems at will, for the people as legislators are very dangerous. They only establish laws which coincide with their passions. Their want of knowledge would besides only give birth to abuses. But as people are a lever which legislators can move at their will, we must necessarily use them as a support, and render hateful to them everything we wish to destroy, and sow illusions in their path. We must also buy all the mercenary pens which propagate our methods. So the media, they got to buy off the media, and which will instruct the people concerning their enemies, which we attack. The clergy, being the most powerful through public opinion, can only be destroyed by ridiculing religion, rendering its ministers uh, odious, and the only representing them as hypocritical monsters. Liberals must at every moment show fresh traces of hatred against the clergy, to exaggerate their riches, to make the sins of an individual appear to be common to all, to attribute to them all vices, calumny, murder, irreligion, sacrilege. All is permitted in times of revolution. So slander, in other words. Just slander anybody that gets in their way, especially clergy in the churches. Not to mention infiltrating the churches with their people. And that's where we're at now, but that's another subject. We must degrade the noblices and attribute it to an odorous origin, establish a germ of equality which can never exist but which will flatter the people. We must emulate the most obstinate, burn and destroy their property in order to intimidate the rest, so that if we cannot entirely destroy this prejudice, we can weaken it, and the people will avenge their vanity and jealousy by all the excesses which will bring to them submission. After describing how the soldiers are to be seduced from their allegiance and the magistrates represented to the people as despots, since the people, brutal and ignorant, only see the evil and never the good of things, the writer explains they must be given only limited power and uh, municipalities, municipalities. I don't know. Quote, let us beware above all the giving them too much force. Their despotism is too dangerous. We must flatter the people by gracious justice. Promise them a great, uh, cut on taxes and a more equal division, more extension in fortunes, and less humiliation. These vestiges will fantasize the people, who will flatten out all resistance. What matters the victim of their numbers? Spoliations, destructions, burnings, and all the necessary effects of a revolution. Nothing must be sacred, and we can say with Machiavelli, quote, what matter the means as long as one arrives at the end? The early phase of the revolution, That of the constitutional monarchy and the Declaration of the Rights of Men was led by the more idealistic kinds of Freemasons, but at later stages was controlled by the Jacobin Illuminati with their radically destructive plans. Thus, according to Labarre de Lorraine's writings in 1820, quote, France in 1789 counted more than 2,000 lodges affiliated to the Grand Orient. The number of adepts was more than 1,000. The first event of 1789 were only Masonry in action. All the revolutionaries of the Constituent Assembly were initiated into the third degree, placed in the class Duc d'Orléans, Valence, Sillery, Lecloux, Sieyès, Pétion, Bounon, Biron, I don't know, a bunch of French names. Among these others, continued Webster, were not only the Bristons who formed the nucleus of the Girondin party, but the men of terror, Marat, Robespierre, Danton, and Desmoulins. It was these fiercer elements, the true disciples of the Illuminati, who were to sweep away the visionary Masons dreaming of equality and brotherhood. Following the precedent set by Weishaupt, classical pseudonyms were adopted by these leaders of the Jacobins. The Chomet was known as Anaxagoras, Cloutz as Anarchirus, Danton as Horace, Lacroix as Publicola, and Ronson as Scaevola, again after the manner of the Illuminati. The names of towns were changed and a revolutionary calendar was adopted. The red cap and loose hair affected by the Jacobins appeared also to have been foreshadowed in the lodges of the Illuminati. Yet faithfully as the terrorists carried out the plan of the Illuminati, it would seem that they themselves were not initiated into the inner secrets of the conspiracy. Behind the convention, behind the clubs, behind the revolutionary tribunal, there exists, says Labarre de Lorraine's, that most secret conventions were directed everything after May 31st, an occult and terrible power which the other convention became the slave for, which composed the prime initiates of Illuminism, this power above Robespierre and the committees of the government. It was this occult power which appointed to itself the treasurers of the nation, distributed them to the brothers and friends who had helped on the great work. What was this occult power that controlled even the Illuminati? Many writers think that it was the Talmudists, the rabbinic leaders of the Jewish people. However, the final triumph of the Talmudists was delayed temporarily by an excess of the revolutionary zeal they had themselves stimulated. In the local communes, writes L.A. Tikhomirov, quote, individual groups, especially wild Jacobins who had been initiated into higher politics, sometimes broke into synagogues, destroying the Torah and books, but it was only by 1794 that the revolutionary atheistic logic finally forced even the bosses to pose the question of the annihilation not only of Catholicism but of Jewry at this point. However, the Jays were delivered by 9 Thermidor. 1794, Robespierre fell and was executed. The moderate elements triumphed. The question of the ban of Jewry disappeared of itself, while the Constitution of the year 3 of the Republic granted equal rights to the Jays. Okay, so I'm almost done with this. So we're at Napoleon, and then I'm gonna wrap up after that. Okay. By the end of the 18th century, the revolution appeared to have lost its way, consumed by poverty, corruption, mutual bloodletting. It was saved by a young soldier, Napoleon Bonaparte, who was sincerely faithful to the spirit of the French Revolution, as Cromwell had been to the English. The Mason Christopher Hodap writes, quote, it was rumored for many years that Napoleon Bonaparte was a Freemason, but there is no historic proof of it. Still, many of his military officers were members of the Grand Council for the Empire, and 22 of the 30 marshals of France were. So were his 4 brothers, 3 of whom were made kings by Napoleon. The emperor's wife, Empress Josephine, was even admitted into a French female lodge in 1804. Oh, come on. Regardless of whether Napoleon was ever made a Mason, he did adopt the title of Protector of Freemasonry, along with the lengthy list of other titles he assumed when he became the emperor in 1804. Madame de Staël called him Robespierre on horseback. After all, he came from Corsica, which in 1755 had successfully rebelled against Genoa, and for which Rousseau wrote one of his most seminal works, Project de Constitution pour la Corse. I don't know. I tried. In 1765, but like Cromwell and Caesar, he had found that in order to save the Republic, he had to take control of it and rule it like a king. His chance came on 19 Brumaire, November 10th, 1799, when he overthrew the Directory, describing parliamentarism as, quote, hot air, and frightened the two elective assemblies into submission. On December 13th, a new constitution was proclaimed by Bonaparte at the first three consuls with full executive powers, and on December 15th, the three consuls declared, quote, citizens, the revolution is established upon its original principles. It is consummated. Paul Johnson writes, quote, the first few consul was far more powerful than Louis XIV since he dominated the air forces directly in a country that was now organized as a military state. All the ancient restraints of divine right kingship, the church, the aristocracy, and the resources, the courts, the cities and their charters, the universities and their privileges, the guilds and their immunities, all had been swept away by the revolution, leaving France as a legal blank on which Bonaparte could stamp the irresistible force of his personality. But again, like Caesar and Cromwell, he could never confess to being a king in the traditional sense. Under him, in Norman Davies' phrase, a quote, pseudo monarchy headed pseudo democratic institutions. So, as J.M. Roberts writes, while Napoleon instituted monarchy, quote, it was in no sense a restoration. Indeed, he took care to affront the exiled Bourbon family that any, I guess, Bourbon family? That any reconciliation with it was inconceivable. He sought popular approval for the empire in the plebiscite and got it. Quote, this was a monarchy Frenchmen had voted for. It rested on popular sovereignty, that is, the revolution. It assumed the consolidation of the revolution with the constituent had already begun. All the great institutional reforms of the 1790s were confirmed or at least left intact. There was no disturbance on the land sales which had followed the confiscation of church property, no resurrection of the old corporations, no questions of the principle of equality before the law. Some measures were even taken further. Notably, even each department was given an administrative head, the prefect, who was in his power something like one of the emergency emissaries of the terror. Cromwell had eschewed the trappings of monarchy, but Napoleon embraced them avidly. The trend towards monarchy and hierarchy developed. Quote, earlier than it is generally thought, writes Philip Menzel, quote, the first consul Bonaparte aligned himself with a monarchical trend, acquiring his succession a guard. In 1799, a palace in the 1800s, court receptions and costumes, 1800 through 1802, okay, a palace, um, reception costumes, a household, a dynasty by 1804, finally a nobility in 1808. The proclamation of the empire in May 1804, the establishment of the households, the emperor, the empress, the imperial family in July, the coronation of the pope in December of that year were confirmations of an existing monarchical reality. Moreover, Napoleon spread monarchy throughout Europe. The kingdoms and grand duchies of Italy, Venice, Rome, Naples, Lucca, uh, Holland, Mainz, Bavaria, Württemberg, Saxony, Baden, Hessen, Darmstadt, Westphalia, and Spain were all established or re-established with still greater monarchical power, and all ruled by Napoleon's relation by blood or marriage. According to Stendhal, Napoleon's court, quote, totally corrupted him and exalted him to the state of a disease. He was on the point of making Europe one vast monarchy. Quote, the French Empire shall become the metropolitan of all other sovereignties. Napoleon once said to a friend, quote, I want to force every king in Europe to build a large palace for his use in Paris. When an emperor of the French is crowned, these kings shall come to Paris, and they shall adorn their imposing ceremony with their presence and statue with their homage. Quote, as one of his secretaries, Baron Menneval, wrote he himself, as, quote, the pillar of the royalty in Europe on January 18th, 1813, he wrote to his brother Jerome that his enemies, by the appeal to popular feeling, represented upheavals and revolutions, pernicious doctrines in Napoleon's opinion, and to his fellow monarchs were traitors to their own cause. When in 1813 they began to desert the French Empire, or in 1814 refused to accept his territorial terms for peace. Jocelyn Hunt writes, quote, kings before 1791 were said to be absolute, but were limited by all kinds of constraints and controls. The church had almost autonomous status. Bonaparte assured that the church was merely a branch of the civil service. Kings were anointed by the church and thus owed their authority to God. Bonaparte took power through his own strength. Camouflage as the general will, which, as Corneille Barnett acidly remarks, quote, became synonymous with General Bonaparte. When he became emperor in 1804, he crowned himself. So he wasn't coronated, in other words. So, a true monarch is going to be coronated by the church. There's a sacrament, and the Holy Spirit's like blesses this thing. He put himself in that position, which is kind of the same thing with, like, happened in Russia. Same thing. Okay, so. Lost my place. The first council of choice of ministers was far more personal than had been possible for the kings of France. Bonaparte established a system of meeting in ministers individually, or give his instructions in the same way. Bonaparte chose which ordinary citizens he would consult. Kings of France had mechanisms for consulting the people, but these had fallen into disuse, and thus, when the Estates General met in 1789, the effect was revolutionary. Bonaparte's legislative body was until 1814 submissive and compliant. Quote, police control and limitations on personal freedom had been a focus of condemnation by the philosophies before the Revolution, but not had been entirely efficient. A whole industry of importing and distributing banned texts had flourished in the 1770s and 1780s. Bonaparte's policies were more thorough, and so swingingly were the penalties that the self-censorship rapidly became the safest path for a newspaper to take. Bonaparte closed down 60 to 73 newspapers in Paris in January of 1800, and had a weekly summary prepared of all printed materials. But he was soon able to tell by his chief of police, Fauci, they once print that I want them to. They only print what I want them to. In the same way, the hated letters de Chachet appeared limited and efficient when compared to Bonaparte and Fauci's record of policy spies. This guy's name is Fauci. This is craziness. Trials without jury and imprisonment without trial. Bonaparte's brief experience as a Jacobin leader and Ajaccio had taught him how to recognize and deal with potential opponents. The judiciary had stood apart from the kings of the Ancien regime. While the king was nominally the supreme judge, the training of lawyers and judges had been a matter of the parliament, with their inherent privileges and mechanism. The parliaments decided whether the king's law were acceptable with the fundamental laws of France. And under the consulate, there were such constraints on the legislator. The judges were his appointees and held office entirely at pleasure. At his pleasure, the courts disposed of those opposed or questioned the government far more rapidly than had been possible in the reign of Louis. Imprisonment and deportation became regularly used instruments and control on the Bonaparte. Kings of France. Okay, I give up. I can't finish this article. I'm done. Doubt it. I think he's just one of many. All right. Opposed. What was that? I gotta read that one more time. I'll leave on that. I don't know. I might rename this video. Depose those opposed. Wait. Pleasure. The courts depose of those who oppose. That was it. Okay. All right. I'm out.